He climbed my locked gate like it was his right, and when I told him to get out, he said his mother owned the HOA and that I wasn't allowed to tell him anything. 10 minutes later, he'd called 911. 10 more, and I was standing across from 2 officers, shirt still damp from the pool, hands dry and empty but my mouth holding the truth they didn't expect. You see, I'd been quiet since I moved here, quiet enough to be ignored. But what no one realized, not Karen, not her son, not even the police, was that the title to this house said something they hadn't bothered to read. And when I showed it to them, the silence that followed, that was the sound of consequences. Stick around, because by the time this ends, even Karen's lawyer was speechless. Like, subscribe, and let's get into it. The morning sun slid across the surface of the pool like honey, slow and golden, catching every ripple left by the breeze. I'd just finished skimming leaves from the deep end, the same way I did every Saturday, when I heard the faint clatter of metal behind me. It wasn't the wind. I turned, squinting against the light, and there he was. A teenage boy, probably 16 or 17, swinging one leg over my locked iron gate like it was a jungle gym. His foot caught briefly on the decorative scrollwork, and for a second I thought he might fall. But he landed with a graceless thud inside my yard, shook out his shoulders like he owned the place, and marched straight toward the pool. I called out, asking who he was and what he thought he was doing, trying to keep my tone level. He barely glanced at me before pulling off his shirt and kicking off his slides. Then he muttered something about just swimming a few laps and said his mum told him it was fine. My chest tightened. I asked him, again, who his mother was. That got his attention. He looked at me with the kind of practiced arrogance only a kid with too much inherited power can wear, and said, "Karen Walker. She runs the HOA. You're new, so you probably didn't know. We have access." He was already crouching by the edge, about to slip into the water. I stepped between him and the pool and pointed to the sign bolted beside the gate, the one that clearly stated this was a private residence and not part of the neighborhood amenities. He rolled his eyes and laughed, muttering something under his breath. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I walked over to the latch, snapped the padlock closed, and told him to leave. He looked stunned, then pulled out his phone. "You just made a big mistake," he said, scrolling like his fingers had done it 1,000 times before. "I'm calling the cops." He stood there shirtless, phone to his ear, pacing beside my pool like it was his backyard and I'd somehow wandered into it by mistake. His chest puffed with that teenage certainty that the world would bend to him, and his mouth twisted into a smug grin as he glanced over at me, like this was a game he knew he'd already won. I stayed where I was, arms crossed, watching him describe the situation to the dispatcher in increasingly dramatic terms. He said I was threatening him, that I'd locked him inside the yard, that I was acting crazy. It didn't matter that the gate was wide open and that he had climbed it to get in. Details weren't his concern. Winning the story was. When he hung up, he made a show of slipping the phone into his shorts pocket. Then he looked at me and smirked. "You're really going to regret that," he said. "My mum's on the HOA board. She practically owns this neighborhood. You think they're going to side with you over me?" I didn't answer. I'd lived long enough to know that silence was more unnerving than shouting. He waited for a reaction, then laughed under his breath like I was some joke he'd already told before. "You must be renting," he said. "People like you don't usually buy in here." He didn't say what he meant by people like you, but he didn't have to. I'd heard it before. Same tone, different words. He looked around the yard, probably searching for something to criticize, something out of place to use as leverage. But the grass was cut, the pavers clean, the furniture in perfect order. Everything about my place was cared for, from the stained wood of the fence to the crisp corners of the flag I kept folded by the porch. Still, he kept talking. "The HOA rules say the pool's supposed to stay unlocked. That's for community use. You can't just do whatever you want." I told him calmly that this wasn't a community pool, that it wasn't under the HOA's jurisdiction, that I owned the property, every square inch of it. He waved me off like I was speaking a language he didn't care to understand. "Doesn't matter," he said. "My mum's going to have you written up, fined, or kicked out, whatever it takes." And then he sat down on one of my chairs, stretched out, and smiled like he was already celebrating the outcome. He sat there like he'd done it before, like kicking his feet up on furniture that didn't belong to him was just another part of summer. The sun hit the water behind him, catching in his hair, making the whole scene look almost peaceful if not for the tension thickening in the air between us. I didn't move. I'd been raised to handle worse with less. Men shouting in uniform, supervisors whispering attitude behind their teeth when I asked questions they didn't want to answer. This boy wasn't the first person to underestimate me, and he surely wouldn't be the last. A few minutes passed before I heard the distant hum of an engine. It grew louder, steady, then cut as a patrol car pulled up outside my gate. He sat up straight like someone had just called his name at graduation. "They're here," he said, standing and stretching like a cat. "Told you." He walked to the edge of the yard and shouted through the bars, flagging down the officers like he was the one offering them coffee. One of them, tall and lean with a smooth jaw and mirrored sunglasses, stepped through the gate without waiting for permission. The second hung back, a little older, slower in his movements, glancing between us like he was already wondering why he'd been called at all. The boy launched into his story, voice pitching upward, hands flying. He pointed at me, then at the pool, then back at me again. I watched the taller officer's mouth tighten. He didn't look at me yet, just nodded along while the boy wove his tale of unjust treatment, of being locked out, then locked in, and how the homeowner me refused to follow the rules everyone else did. I waited for them to turn to me. I didn't interrupt. I just stood beside the locked gate, arms at my sides, heart steady, watching the older officer's eyes flick over to the private property sign bolted into the stone column. Finally, the younger cop turned to me. "Sir, we're responding to a complaint about unauthorized detainment and restriction of access to a shared facility. Is there a reason you locked this young man out of the pool?" I met his gaze, slow and deliberate. "There's a reason. But before we go further, I'd like to know whether either of you has read the property lines on this parcel. Because if not, we're going to be talking about more than just trespassing." His mouth opened, then closed. The boy's smirk twitched. The older officer finally stepped inside and asked me for ID. I nodded and went to get it. It was time to let the paperwork speak. When I came back outside, I had my wallet in one hand and a folder in the other. The boy was still lounging like he had nothing to worry about. He looked up and muttered something to the younger officer, who laughed and adjusted the sunglasses on his face. I handed over my ID first. The older officer took it, glancing between my name and the house. He nodded slowly, said thank you, and asked if I had proof of ownership. I offered the folder. Inside were the closing documents, the deed, and a few pages flagged with neon tabs. He stepped off to the side to flip through them, eyes scanning each page longer than I expected. The younger one didn't look at the papers. He just stood near the boy and watched me like he was waiting for a wrong move. "You're still not allowed to lock shared spaces," the boy said, louder this time. "My mom said that's like, in the bylaws." I turned to him. "This isn't a shared space. This home sits on a lot not included in the HOA charter. Your mother should know that." He blinked like I'd spoken in another language. The younger officer crossed his arms. "I'm going to need to verify that through the HOA, he said, voice clipped. The older officer cleared his throat and looked up from the folder. "This is a private residence. It's clearly documented. There's no HOA jurisdiction on this lot." The boy's head snapped toward him. "That's not what my mom said." "She was mistaken," the officer said quietly. He handed the folder back to me. "Thank you for being organized." The younger cop still didn't look satisfied. "We'll still need to file a report. For the record, he said you locked the gate while he was inside." I looked him in the eye. "He climbed in. I locked it after he ignored me." The older officer gave a single nod. "We'll include both statements." The boy muttered something under his breath, arms crossed. For the first time, his confidence had cracked, just slightly. I sat down on the edge of a patio chair, not to prove a point, but because I was done standing for what shouldn't have taken this much effort to explain. The boy kept glancing toward the street, like someone else might arrive and fix this for him, but no one came. The sun kept rising, and the truth stayed exactly where it had been since I signed the papers to this house. Firm, documented, unshakable. The younger officer stood by the gate, his radio crackling softly, fingers resting near the mic on his shoulder like he expected something else to come through. His posture was tense, still not ready to let go of the story he'd been given. The boy leaned against the fence, arms folded, scowling now instead of smug. His confidence had started to thin around the edges, but he wasn't ready to back down. I sat with the folder in my lap, flipping through the pages until I found the one I'd flagged months ago. It was a copy of the development's plat map, stamped and signed, showing which lots fell under the HOA and which ones didn't. Mine was clearly marked, one of 3 properties that had been excluded before the neighborhood bylaws had been finalized. A relic from the original builder's deal with the county, long before Karen and her kind had started measuring grass heights and mailbox colors. I handed that single page to the older officer. He looked at it closely, then pulled out his phone and took a photo of it. I told him he was welcome to keep the copy. I had more inside, and better scans saved on a thumb drive. The younger one finally came over. He looked at the map, then at me, then at the boy. Something passed behind his eyes. Maybe doubt, maybe regret. Maybe just the sinking realization that this wasn't going to be a clean little power trip. He said the gate was locked, the officer said again, quieter this time. It was, I replied, after he jumped over it. Why? Because this is my property. He wasn't invited, and I don't tolerate trespassing, no matter who someone's mother is. The boy kicked at a stone with his flip-flop and muttered, "Whatever. This place is lame anyway." He started walking toward the gate, muttering louder as he passed the officers, trying to save face. The younger cop followed him, said he'd get the report started. The older one lingered. He glanced around the yard, then looked at me. "You handled this well," he said. "I've had practice," I told him. He gave a half smile, nodded once, and left. I watched them go, the patrol car easing down the street, the boy in the passenger seat still waving his arms, probably trying to rewrite the story one last time. But the papers were still in my hands, and the truth had already been recorded. It was quiet again. I picked up the lock from the patio table and slid it back onto the gate. This time, it clicked shut without a sound. When I bought the house, it wasn't because of the pool or the corner lot or the oversized garage. It was the boundary lines. The exact lines, printed and recorded, that placed this property just outside the grip of the homeowners association. Not everyone cared about that kind of detail, but I did. I'd lived in enough places where small people found big power in rules written to keep control, and I wasn't interested in signing up for more of that. My realtor hadn't even noticed it at first. She had breezed through the listing, talking about curb appeal and nearby schools, but I asked her to send me the full packet. The kind with the development's history, the maps, the builder's intent, and that's where I found the waiver. 3 homes, built during the initial phase, were never included in the final charter when the HOA was formed. The lots had already closed before the board paperwork was filed. Those owners kept their independence. Mine was one of them. I hired a lawyer just to double-check, not because I didn't trust the paperwork, but because I knew what could happen when assumptions started shaping the truth. He confirmed it all. No dues. No board oversight. No mandatory guidelines about fence, height, mailbox color, or pool access. It was mine. And once I signed, it became official in the only way that matters. Of course, not everyone in the neighborhood understood that. Most assumed we were all under the same umbrella. It had never come up before. I kept to myself. I waved when waved at. I didn't leave trash out, and I trimmed my hedges. Quiet was easy when no one had a reason to make noise. But Karen had never liked the idea of not having jurisdiction. Not over me, not over anyone. She once left a note on my door about approved seasonal decorations. I didn't respond. That silence must have bothered her more than anything I could have said. It wasn't until her son tried to use my pool that her real problem took shape. Because control only works when everyone plays along. And I had chosen, long before I ever met her, not to be part of that game. I was finishing my coffee on the porch when I heard the sharp clip of heels on pavement. The sound carried with a kind of purpose, fast and punctuated, like someone marching into a courtroom they believed they owned. Karen rounded the corner of my walkway in a blazer, far too stiff for the heat, one hand clutching a leather folder, the other gesturing wildly as she spoke into her phone. She didn't knock, she didn't greet. She walked right past the gate, unlatched it without asking, and stormed into the yard like it had always belonged to her. Behind her trailed the same officer from before, the younger one, his expression unreadable. Her son followed a few steps behind, dragging his feet and glancing at the ground like it might offer him a way out of the moment. Karen stopped in front of me, hands on her hips. She looked me up and down like I was something she needed to clean up. Her voice was clipped, professional, too loud for the distance between us. "I just spoke with the HOA legal counsel," she said. "There's been a misunderstanding. This pool is subject to shared access, and your behavior this morning violated several codes, including child endangerment." She waved the folder slightly, as if its weight alone could change the facts. I stood up, still holding my mug, and looked her in the eye. "This house is exempt. It always has been." She let out a short laugh. "That's not how this works. You can't just claim you're not part of the HOA. We have clear boundaries, and every home in this development falls under our jurisdiction." "Not every home," I said. She opened her folder and flipped through a few pages, then held up one with a highlighted paragraph. "It's right here. Section 14, Shared Amenities Clause. This includes pools, community centers, and outdoor recreation areas. Whether you like it or not, you agreed to this by purchasing here." I pulled a folded document from my pocket and handed it to her. She snatched it, unfolded it quickly, and began reading. Her lips moved silently through the lines, eyes darting back and forth. Her jaw tightened. "What is this?" she asked. "An exemption letter, filed in 2007, recorded with the county. It excludes this lot from the HOA. Developer's signature, notarized." Her son looked over her shoulder. The officer leaned in, peering at the paper. Karen didn't speak for several long seconds. When she finally looked up, something had shifted behind her eyes. Not defeat exactly, but the recognition that she had overstepped and wasn't ready to admit it. "We'll need to review this with our legal team," she said. "You do that," I replied. "In the meantime, stay off my property." She didn't move. The officer touched her elbow, a small nudge meant to be polite. She pulled her arm away, but she turned all the same, walking back toward the street with the same hard footsteps. Her son followed, quieter now, saying nothing. I watched them go, the gate swinging shut behind them. I didn't lock it this time. I didn't need to. 2 days later, a letter arrived. It was folded neatly in a cream envelope, the kind used for wedding invites and board elections, with the HOA logo embossed on the flap. I opened it on the porch, already knowing who it was from. Inside was a formal notice, signed by Karen and another board member, citing uncooperative behavior, misrepresentation of property status, and a request for an emergency hearing to determine my compliance standing. I smiled without humor and folded the letter in half. The second letter came that same afternoon, slipped under my door while I was out back tending the rose bushes. It was from the original developer. I had reached out to his office months before the purchase, asking for written confirmation of what I already knew. He had sent it, signed and sealed, confirming my exemption. Now, in response to recent events, he'd sent a notarized follow-up, a reaffirmation of the legal boundaries, with updated county filings and a clean clause that made everything clear in simple terms. This property was not, and never had been, under HOA governance. I took both letters and added them to the folder. Then I printed the full plat map again, this time with a second copy for the HOA board. I highlighted the developer's signature and the legal parcel boundary. I placed the originals in a sleeve and kept them in the safe. The rest I sealed in an envelope marked Board Review. The next morning, I walked it over to the clubhouse myself. Karen was inside, pacing near the front desk, mid-conversation with someone on the phone. Her voice dropped when she saw me, but her eyes stayed sharp. I set the envelope on the desk and met her stare with a calm she didn't know what to do with. "This should clear up any confusion," I said. She didn't respond, just stood still, lips tight. Someone else behind the desk picked it up, glanced at the label, and nodded. Outside, the sun was just beginning to rise. The streets were quiet. A few neighbors out walking dogs looked over as I passed, their faces curious but silent. Word had spread. It always did. Back at home, I unlocked the gate, stepped through, and let it swing shut behind me. Not in anger, not in pride. Just with the ease of someone who knew where the line had been drawn and wasn't the one who had crossed it. It was the following Thursday when my phone rang. The number was familiar, one of those I'd saved just in case but had never expected to use. I answered it on the second ring and heard the voice of the HOA board secretary, her tone lighter than I expected. "We received your documents," she said. "The matter's been reviewed. I wanted to let you know that everything is in order." I thanked her and asked if Karen would be informed. There was a pause, just long enough to hint at hesitation, then a quiet, "Yes. In fact, the board met last night." She was advised to step down from her role in compliance oversight. The rest of the board agreed it was for the best. I didn't say anything for a moment. The sound of lawnmowers and birds filled the silence on my end. "She'll remain on the board, for now," the woman continued, "but she won't be handling enforcement." "Understood," I said. That evening, a notice was posted at the clubhouse. It listed new assignments for various board members. Karen's name was there, shifted into a vague title that held no authority. Below her, under the heading for compliance oversight, was mine. They had offered it without fanfare. No one came to the door with flowers or handshakes. Just an email earlier that afternoon, asking if I would consider accepting a temporary role while the board reorganized. I hadn't said yes for the power. I said yes because I believed in lines being where they belonged. That night, I walked the length of my fence, from one end of the lot to the other. I checked every post and every latch. Not out of paranoia, but principle. The gate held firm. The locks sat just as they should, and the still water in the pool reflected the porch light like nothing had ever disturbed it. Saturday morning came with a clear sky and the hum of sprinklers down the street. I was out back tightening the cover on the grill when I heard laughter near the sidewalk. A group of kids passed by on bikes, none of them bothering to glance toward the yard. Just past them walked Karen's son, hoodie pulled low, earbuds in, eyes down. He didn't stop. He didn't even slow. But he saw me. I knew that much. The tilt of his head gave it away, the brief glance sideways before he turned the corner. I didn't wave. There was nothing left to say. Karen hadn't spoken to me since the meeting. She still attended board functions, still walked the neighborhood in those sharp-heeled shoes, still carried her leather folder like it held something that mattered. But she no longer looked through me. She looked past me now, like a woman learning to adjust to a world that no longer let her walk through every door without question. Later that afternoon, I stepped out with a towel slung over my shoulder and walked to the pool. The sun had reached its peak, bright and unbothered by the past week. I lowered myself into the water slowly, one step at a time, the heat slipping away as the cool surrounded me. For a long while I didn't move. I let the water hold me. The ripples smoothed out, and the sound of the world faded. A wind moved through the trees, stirring the flag by the porch. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A mower started. Life carried on. I floated, arms wide, and thought not of the shouting or the papers or the gate, but of the quiet, the kind that came when things finally settled back where they belonged. The clause was buried deep in the documents. Most people wouldn't have found it, and even if they had, they might not have understood its weight. It sat near the end of the original developer agreement, tucked between zoning acknowledgements and drainage easements. Just one line, clear and final. Lots 1, 2, and 3 are exempt from the governing authority of the subdivision's homeowners association, present or future. That was it. No conditions, no expiration, no footnotes pointing elsewhere. The exemption was filed with the county, stamped by the clerk, and signed in ink older than half the board members who'd tried to dispute it. When I first read it, I didn't smile or celebrate. I just underlined it with a blue pen and made 3 copies, one for the lawyer, one for the safe, and one to carry with me until the keys were in my hand. It didn't matter that the neighborhood had grown around me, that new rules had been voted in, or that people like Karen came in later and assumed every corner belonged to them. The paper didn't care about their intentions. It didn't bend for board elections or special meetings. What I held in my folder that day wasn't just a defense. It was the map of a line drawn long ago, one they didn't know existed, one they had tripped over without even realizing it. And once they saw it, once it sat in front of them in black and white, there was nothing more to argue. Some truths don't need permission to stand. They just need to be seen. Karen showed up at the next board meeting, but her voice didn't carry like it used to. She took her seat without the usual greeting, without the crisp tap of her folder hitting the table. She looked smaller than before, like the air around her had lost something she couldn't get back. I sat across from her, not by choice, just by the way the table had been arranged. The others nodded when I entered, more respectfully than before, like they finally understood I wasn't someone to talk over. When the minutes were read, Karen didn't correct anything. When new topics came up, she didn't interrupt. Her son's name was never mentioned, but he lingered in the silence between sentences, in the way her hands gripped the sides of her chair. After the meeting ended, the board filtered out slowly. A few stayed behind to ask about the new compliance reports. I answered their questions, steady and measured, and tucked my notes back into the folder I now carried. Not leather, just canvas and clipped at the edges from use. Karen remained seated as the room emptied. She looked at the table, not at me. When she finally rose, her movements were careful, like each step was something to consider. She paused as she passed me, but didn't speak. I didn't stop her. There was no satisfaction in watching her shrink, just the quiet knowledge that she'd been forced to see something she couldn't ignore anymore. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Outside, the night air was still warm. Porch lights glowed up and down the street. Somewhere nearby, someone was watering their lawn, the soft hiss of the hose breaking the silence. I walked to my car, papers under my arm, and drove home without the radio on. Some wins don't feel like victories. They just feel like a line held. 3 weeks later, I sat at the front of the room where the HOA held its quarterly review. The folding chairs were set up in neat rows, and more neighbors had shown up than usual. Maybe they came for the free donuts, or maybe they wanted to see what would happen next. People like a story, especially when it happens on their street. The agenda was short, mostly updates on landscaping, noise complaints, and a broken swing at the community park. When my name came up under compliance review, no one spoke, no challenges, no corrections. The board moved on, without a word. After the meeting, a few residents came up to thank me for how I handled things. One older woman in a sun hat said she'd had her own run-in with Karen years ago, over a ceramic owl in her flower bed. A younger couple asked if I could help them appeal a violation notice about their mailbox color. I told them to send it in writing, and I'd take a look. Karen didn't attend that night. Her seat stayed empty, and no one asked why. As I walked back to my house, I passed by her lawn. The lights were on inside, but the windows were drawn. A for sale sign hadn't appeared, but the grass looked less trimmed than before. The shutters needed a fresh coat. The air around her house felt different now, quieter in a way that said she wasn't watching anymore. I stepped through my own gate, checked the lock without thinking, and paused at the edge of the pool. The water was still, catching the glow from the porch light. Nothing about the yard had changed, but it felt different just the same. That night, I slept with the windows open. No folder by the bed, no weight on my chest. Just the breeze and the sound of everything settling back into place. Late afternoon, sunlight poured across the backyard, warm and steady, casting long shadows that stretched from the fence to the edge of the pool. The neighborhood was quiet. Most folks were inside, hiding from the heat or watching baseball with their feet up. I laid my towel on the chair near the deep end, slipped off my shoes, and let the silence settle in. The water was cool when I stepped in, not shocking, just enough to pull the tension from my back. I moved slowly, letting each stroke carry me across the surface. Not for exercise, not for anything but the comfort of it. There was peace in moving without purpose. No rush. No voice waiting to interrupt. Birdsong drifted through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a screen door creaked open and shut. A car started. The world kept moving. I floated on my back, eyes on the wide blue sky, and let myself drift. The breeze stirred the flag near the porch. The soft flapping of the cloth was the only sound louder than the water. It wasn't a perfect world, but for a moment, this space I had claimed and protected felt whole again. No one climbed the gate. No one shouted from the sidewalk. Just the smell of chlorine and sun-warmed pavement, and the sense that, for now at least, the line I had drawn still held strong. I stayed there long after the sun began to fall behind the rooftops, arms out, body still, not waiting for anything, just listening to what the quiet had to say. You learn a lot about people when they think they have power over you. Some flex it like muscle, loud and proud, expecting you to bow. Others hold it like a leash, pulling just enough to remind you it's there, Karen did both. Her son learned it from her. But power built on assumption always cracks. You don't need to yell to prove your ground is solid. You just need to know where your lines are and refuse to let anyone move them for you. That day by the pool wasn't the first time someone tried to step over a boundary like it didn't matter. It probably won't be the last. But I've learned not to match noise with noise. I let the facts speak. I let the law carry its own weight, and I let people show themselves for what they are. When the shouting fades, when the threats fall flat, there's always a moment of silence. In that silence, truth settles. And if you've stood firm, it doesn't just settle in your favor, it settles with grace. So here's what I've come to believe. Hold the line, even when they laugh, even when they bring back up, even when the crowd says you're wrong because someone louder told them so. Hold it with quiet strength, with clear words, with proof in hand. Because when that line is yours, and you know it's yours, you don't need permission to defend it. You just need the courage not to step back.